Hello and welcome to Midwest Writers Room. Our mission is to encourage, educate, and celebrate writers of the Midwest. I'm Luella Schmidt.
And I'm Ken Humphrey. Today's chapter break episode features Pernille Ipsen and her latest publication, My Seven Mothers, Making a Family in the Danish Women's Movement, which came out October 21st, 2025.
Pernille Ipsen was professor of gender and women's studies and history at the University of Wisconsin-Madison for 15 years and is now a full-time writer. The Danish language version of this book, Pernille, do you want to give us the title?
I would love to. It's called Et åbent øjeblik in Danish.
Fantastic. You can see why I didn't want to read that, listeners. It was published in 2020 and was awarded the Montana Prize for Literature, one of Denmark's top literary prizes. She divides her time between Madison and Copenhagen, Denmark.
So let's take a look at the book itself. Here's a quick synopsis. On New Year's Eve in Copenhagen in 1972, 7 women had a child together. 1 gave birth and 6 others attended. They had met a year earlier at a feminist women's camp on a small island, and now, with about 20 other women's liberationists, they occupied 3 dilapidated apartment buildings in the center of Copenhagen. One became the country's first women's house, the nerve center of the women's movement in Denmark, and the other 2 were women-only communal living spaces that were Pernille Ipsen's first home. In this intimate portrait of life during the exhilarating early days of women's liberation in Scandinavia and dramatic social change around the globe, she tells the stories of these 7 women, her 7 mothers.
Boy, we are really excited to chat with you about this. Welcome, Pernille, to Midwest Writers Room. How are you doing today?
Thank you so much. It's really wonderful to be here.
Yep, so we're going to delve into some new areas, at least for me, and I'm very interested in this one. So, based on your background, it's clear where the seed of this book came from, but can you trace back to that moment when you knew it was a story you wanted to tell?
Sure. I have tried to locate that moment very specifically in the book, and so I've given it some thought. So I've lived with this story my whole life, right? It's my own history. And when I was a young teenager, I started thinking about it as a story I needed to tell. So when I was about 16 years old, I had this one moment where I was sitting with my mothers and they were sharing stories from the past, and the stories sort of coalesced around me, and I was sitting in the middle of it. I was my mother's only child, and so maybe felt some responsibility towards their story, but also was just super fascinated by the lives they had lived before I was born. And so I was 16 when I first decided I wanted to write this book. And then it took me a while because I became a historian first and got tenure and 2 children and moved to Madison, and many other things happened. And then I started interviewing my mothers in 2009 when I had first arrived here in Madison.
This is just fascinating to me, this type of family life. So did you call them all mom or mother? Or did you say mother first name? I mean, how did you address them when in a group?
So when I was little, I should start by saying that we only all lived together until I was 4. And after that, I was sort of a weekend child in the commune. My birth mother, Sanne, moved out of the commune when I was 4. So after that, I still called them mom, but it was not a solid commune anymore as it had been before I was 4. Until I was 4, I called them all mom. And I would often call them mom and then by first name. So mom Sanne, mom Hanne, mom Vibeke, mom Lotte, and on. But I would also just use the term mom for come and help me, adult person in my life, come and take care of me or do something for me or whatever. So it was sort of I would just speak the word out into the room and hope that somebody, reacted, and they usually did. So I had a very close relationship to the word mom when I was little, yeah.
Oh, interesting. So I do that today to my wife. Adult person, can you help me find the mayonnaise? I can't see it. It doesn't come off the same.
And what word do you use for that?
I just say adult person. That's how I
Adult
like to
person?
refer to my wife. Adult person. No, I'm just kidding. So when you finished this book, what was your path to publication like? How did you approach publishers?
So I started interviewing my mothers in 2009 at the same time that I started my tenure track job at UW-Madison in the history and gender and women's studies departments. And in the beginning, I thought I would write the book in English. I was writing another book in English at the time as a historian, and I'd written in English for a while, and I was living here in Madison. And so when I started interviewing my mothers, I thought that I would be writing in English. That was what I had been doing for a while. So it was kind of surprising to me when I realized that I needed to write the book in Danish. And it was kind of a longer process. But in 2015, I decided I was going to write it in Danish because it brought me much closer to the story itself, to my mother's, but also because I wasn't writing an academic book. And I found that moving away from academic writing was a little easier when I also switched languages. So I did a whole sort of turn at that point and started writing in a new genre, returned to my childhood language, and then pursued a publisher in Denmark and sent a book proposal to a big publisher in Denmark who I liked. And they took it right away, and before I had written it. And so I started having conversations with them about the book and what I was going to do. And then from that point on, it took another 5 years till the book came out. But that's yeah.
Isn't that
The short.
fascinating that you were an academic basically, and in order to sort of access that part of you that needed to be that storytelling, you went back to your sort of childhood language. I don't know. I just thought that was sort of fascinating, and also mad skills that anybody can do that.
It sounds really easy in hindsight, you know, if you had asked me in the moment when I started experimenting with Danish again, it wasn't easy, just because it wasn't my, you know, I had lived here and been immersed in English for a while, and had, you know, and even before I moved to the US, I was writing in English because many historians do to reach a broader audience, right? And so it was a process for sure, but it made a lot of intuitive sense to me to do that, just because all my interviews, of course, were in Danish, but also because to remember all the details and to remember what my early childhood felt like, it was much easier to do in Danish. And then it sort of opened a whole new sort of side of my writing to return. So I would recommend, if you have another language latent there in the back of your mind, to try to experiment writing something new in that. But yeah.
It's very neat. So as you were, writing this book, did you have any, big, I don't know, aha moments or struggles along the way that kind of made a pivot, or tell us about it a little bit?
So I had many, I lived with the book for a long time. I started interviewing in 2009, and then the book came out in 2020. So I had lived with it, off and on, and mostly in the summers, when I was in Denmark. And since it was in Danish and kind of not an academic book, it had to happen on my free time, right? And so it would happen next to a very busy life as an academic. So I didn't like fully lean into it until I had tenure, and in 2016, and I was on leave from my academic job, and I could be in Denmark and could really lean into it. But for the first many years, it was still sort of with me as this thing I was doing, and the thing I really wanted to do. One of the very big aha moments I've had from this whole process is all the social work that the book has done for me and for my mothers. The writing our shared history and going back and forth with them on the details for all the scenes that I have been writing. So I've tried to embrace some really detailed scenes in the book, and all of those little details I had to, get from somewhere. So often it was calling them and saying, like, I know you say you don't remember, but can we in some way dig out, what color your dress was that day, or, how you got from the taxi to the train station, or whatever it was. And all those little details, you know, in SMSs and in phone calls and in long, long, long conversations really became sort of a glue that tied us together in this very moving way. So when the book came out in 2020, I felt closer to my moms than I had since I was a young child. They haven't lived together for many years, and they're still good friends and close to each other, but as a group, like as a commune, they were stronger after I wrote the book by far, and that was really wonderful. And I don't think I had realized what kind of work a writing process like that can do for you and for us.
Never underestimate the power of storytelling, right, Ken?
God.
So tell us a little bit about, I'm curious if there's any differences or contrasts between, you know, the feminist movement in the 70s in Europe versus here.
So that's a big and a good question. So the one thing that comes to mind first is that Denmark is a very small country. So Denmark is the size of Wisconsin, not geographically, because it's way smaller than Wisconsin geographically, but population-wise, it's about 5 million people, though when my mothers were young in the 50s, 60s, it was more like 4 million people. So it was pretty small population, spread out on 500 tiny islands. No, many of the islands are not populated, but there are many, many islands. And because Denmark is such a small and pretty homogenous society compared to the US, not class-wise, but both racially, ethnically, religiously, Denmark is much more homogenous than the US is. The women's movement became much more coherent, though it was not as coherent as we like to make it. But it was one movement in a way in Denmark that it didn't become in the US. So even though many of the issues were the same, the European women's movements were very inspired by the US, and in Denmark especially, American texts, American feminists, American feminists traveling to Denmark were super inspirational. The movement in Denmark took its name after the New York Red Stockings. They didn't have anything to do with the New York Red Stockings otherwise, but they took their name and their consciousness raising groups and many of their sort of practical building blocks from the New York Red Stockings and from the women's movements in the US in general. So in that way, they were kind of similar. They were also similar in that many of their issues were the same. So thinking about how to create a life that was more equal and just for women, but also expanding possibilities, rights, opportunities for families and children, building a life that fit women better, were very much the same political platforms as in the US. The big difference is that because Denmark is such a homogeneous society, and back then was even more so, they actually succeeded. And so many of the issues that American feminists fought for in the 70s actually became real life institutions in Denmark, in what we call the welfare state in Denmark, that grew in the 70s. So this is a short answer to a very big and very good question.
Can you give like one example of a way that it became institutional versus it didn't happen here in the US?
Yeah, so like before my mothers joined the women's movement, or before the women's movement happened in the 70s, there was no parental leave in Denmark. There was no state-sponsored childcare institutions. There was very little support for families and children sending kids to college, for families, for support for families in general. And today, the parental leave policy in Denmark is that every family gets a year of paid parental leave, right, per child. And there's great support for for education. It's free and paid for to go to college. So there's a host of sort of social arrangements in Denmark that were not created by the women's movement alone, but because in the 70s and late 60s is when the Danish welfare state really becomes what it is today. All these institutions are developed, are expanded, and it's very much the result of also the Social Democratic Party and the unions and a broad interest in creating that kind of society. But the women's movement kept the pot boiling, as my mothers would say. Like, they insisted that women and children were to be center and considered fully in this new distribution of economic and social benefits and opportunities in the welfare state as I grew up knowing it.
Yeah. Well, isn't it interesting too that Denmark regularly rates one of the happiest countries on the planet, right? Isn't that true? Like year after year?
Yep,
It is. I mean, Finland is often further up there, but it's very close. Iceland is also very close. But when they do those ratings, they often look at whether people think that their daily lives are fulfilling, healthy.
All right. So since we have a chapter break episode, Pernille is going to read a little bit out of My Seven Mothers and maybe share with our listeners where in your book you're reading from so they can orient themselves.
Yes, I will definitely do that. And I think I will read from the very beginning of the book, so it will be easy for readers to find when they have it in their hands. So this is from the prologue. It's called An Open Moment. On Saturday, June 19th, 1971, Sanne sat on her single mattress in Copenhagen, drinking black coffee and smoking a filter-less cigarette. She had woken up slowly and walked to the kiosk for a newspaper and 10 cigarettes. Back on her mattress, she noticed with some surprise that she enjoyed being alone. Her gray and white kitten slept peacefully and round on the sunny windowsill. It was actually nice just sitting there on my mattress, drinking coffee and reading the paper, Sanne recalls. I was finally free from Per and his demands, his criticism, and his bad energy. Sanne found Thursday's paper in a pile on the floor and flipped again to page 3. Successful feminist action, read the headline. Femø camp in July only for women. She had read the article several times already, but this time she reached for the heavy black telephone on the floor next to her, lifted the receiver, and dialed the number under the article. As she listened to the ringtone, she noticed her heart beating and fought a strong urge to hang up. Femø Women's Camp, a voice answered. Hello, my name is Pernille Ipsen. I would like to sign up for the camp in July. The whole month? Yes, please. The story of My Seven Mothers begins with small moments of courage, such as this decision Sanne made on her mattress. Spending a month among strangers at a feminist women's camp, communal tents and group activities on a remote Danish island was not exactly in Sanne's comfort zone. She was socially awkward. It remains a mystery to me how she dared to sign up for a full month with hundreds of women she had never met. Within a year and a half, Sanne would leap still further into the unknown, not only choosing to raise a child, me, but to do it collectively with 6 other women. In an open moment of radical possibility that built on the political and social transformations of the 60s, all 7 of my mothers undertook some version of Sanne's journey, stepping off the paths laid out for them by parents and society. They traveled from their different hometowns to Copenhagen, breaking free from constraints their childhood worlds had set on them as girls and women, and on to the women's camp on Femø. For 6 weeks, they lived together, dancing, singing, tie-dyeing, and most important, sharing stories of the lives they had lived and the ones they imagined. When the summer was over, determined to continue a women-centered life, my mothers were part of a group of about 30 women's liberationists who squatted in 3 dilapidated apartment buildings in the center of Copenhagen and established them as a woman's house. When I was born into their world on New Year's Eve, 1972, these 7 women became 7 mothers. I owe my life as I came to know it to Sanne's courageous phone call in June 71. Because she spent a summer on Femer and met my other 6 mothers, she gifted me a community of caring women. In fact, I owe my life to a succession of brave acts, large and small. Immediately after that phone call, Sanne's new path required her to walk to the post office to send her payment to the women's camp, and then to patiently stay the course day after day. She walked with her kitten in a park near her apartment and took her strong antidepressants. And at any moment in the 3 weeks between the phone call and her departure for the camp, she could have changed direction. On July 3rd, 1971, a year and a half before she gave birth to me, Sanne sat waiting for a taxi, clutching her white faux leather suitcase and fretting, "Why did I think I could do this?" I still wonder where Sanne's newfound courage came from, but I'm grateful, both for her sake and mine, that she and the other 6 women who became my mothers traveled to Femer in the summer of 71 and began their journey together. This is where my story begins.
Very nice. I caught the few just descriptors of the time, that the white leather suitcase was very 70s in my head. Like I could really picture that, and the big heavy black telephone too. Like that would just be on the floor. Like that was totally a world I remember.
With a dial,
Yeah.
with a dial turn. Yeah.
So tell our listeners where they can find your book and where they can find more about you.
So they should be able to find my book in any bookstore. I know they have it at Rumor One's Own, my local bookstore up on Atwood Avenue. But I also know that they have it on the west side of town here in Madison, and they should have it at any bookstore. And if they don't have it, please go in and ask for it, and they can order it. And they can find me online. I have my own website now, pernilleipsen.com, but also the press, University of Minnesota Press, has an author page where people can contact me through, and that lists, stuff about the book. You can find me on social media, on Instagram and Facebook and such.
Yeah, we'll include links to your socials and your website in the notes.
So do you have any appearances or book signings scheduled?
Well, so the upcoming events are in Iowa. So I'm going to both Des Moines and to Elkhorn, to the Danish Museum in Elkhorn on the 20th, Thursday the 20th, I think. And then I'll be in Denmark for the month of December. And then I have a few events in the spring, but I better not try to remember those in my head. So please find me on social media or on my own webpage, and I will list them there.
All right, very good. Well, at this time, I want to thank Pernille for coming on to the show and introducing her listeners to 7 Danish Mothers. I mean, it's just fascinating to me, just the concept and the explanation behind it. I want to thank everybody out there for hanging with us today in the Midwest Writers Room. I'm Ken Humphrey.
And I'm Luella Schmidt. Words ignite imaginations and spark change. Never underestimate the power of storytelling.
Midwest Writers Room is a production of the Wisconsin Writers Association. Writing and editing by Luella Schmidt and Ken Humphrey. Sound design and editing by Ken Humphrey. Music for the Midwest Writers Room was written by Michael Ramirez C. For more information, please visit wiwrite.org/podcast. Thank you.